Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the fourth of our very popular research webinar series from the Faculty of Education, Humanities and Social Sciences at St Mary's University, Twickenham. Today, the webinar is a collaborative event with the Institute of Economic Affairs, the IEA, and I'm delighted to say that we have with us Dr. Steve Davies, who I'll be introducing properly in a moment. My name is Dr. Kim Salmons, and I'm one of the Associate Deans for Research here at St Mary's. We're a small Catholic university which specialises in sports, health and applied science, as well as business, law and social policy. We also have a new liberal arts degree starting this September, and in the spirit of interdisciplinarity, today is all about bringing together the arts, economics and business to discuss a subject which is uppermost in our minds, that of disease, contamination and globalisation. Now, unfortunately, our speaker, Madeline Grant, can't be with us today, so our format will run a little differently. I'm delighted, however, to introduce Dr. Steve Davies, who is Head of Education at the Institute of Economic Affairs and has previously worked at the Department of History and Economic History at Manchester Metropolitan University and the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University. Dr. Davies is a historian by training. He's written several books, including Empiricism and History, The Wealth Explosion, The Nature and Origins of Modernity, and The Economics and Politics of Brexit, The Realignment of British Public Life. So the format today will be a talk from Steve, which will last about half an hour and will focus on the historical links between disease and globalisation. And then we'll have some discussion time to bring in some thoughts on disease and literary narratives, followed by an opportunity for a Q&A. So if you'd like to ask Steve a question, then please use the Q&A function on the webinar screen. And now I would like to hand over to Dr. Steve Davies, who will deliver his presentation to us. So over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Kim. Well, delighted to be here. Always good to take part in interdisciplinary work. And so without further ado, I'll just share my screen and we'll go into the presentation. So as you'll see here, the title of this presentation is Plagues and Ecumenies, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. Now, first of all, let's start off with some definitions. So an epidemic is technically an outbreak of a highly infectious disease that at least initially has an infection rate greater than 1.0, or it has an R0 number greater than 1.0. What that means is that each new case gives rise to at least one additional case. As long as that is the case, you will have an exponential growth. The steepness of the exponential growth will depend on how big that R number is. Now, the exponential growth doesn't go on forever. It's naturally self-limiting for various reasons. And so you don't ever get a kind of situation where an entire population is affected. There are always various factors that will limit the spread of an epidemic disease beyond a certain point. So there'll always be a peak and then a decline. Now, strictly speaking, a pandemic means a global epidemic. It means an epidemic outbreak which covers the entire planet. But in practice, the term is used rather more loosely to mean any epidemic that has a wide geographical diffusion beyond its initial point of outbreak. There are many, many examples of pandemic in history. So, for example, during the 19th century, we had no less than 6 true global pandemics of cholera between 1819 and the very end of the 19th century in the 1890s. There was a 7th cholera pandemic in the first part of the 20th century, by the way. There have been many other cases, some of which I'll speak about in a moment. There are 2 slightly different kinds of pandemic. What we're talking about here are the true epidemic pandemics, but you can also get ones which are, if you like, endemic. The disease is always around, and then periodically you get a pandemic outbreak of the illness. The 2 classic examples of that are cholera, which I mentioned a moment ago, and smallpox, before it was finally wiped out by the WHO. Another example of that is HIV, which starts off as a classical epidemic, but then settles down as a pandemic illness, an endemic illness, which periodically has local epidemic outbreaks. Now, the headline here is pretty strong on my part. If you read the press at the moment, you'll see a lot of discussion of models put together by epidemiologists to try and explain not only how the pandemic is going on, but what it's likely to do in the future. There's been a lot of attention devoted to one produced by Imperial College London, for example, which is supposedly the source of the current policy that the government is engaging in. I should say that these models typically have a number of possible outcomes. And so they will go from extreme cases, which are typically very low probability, to intermediate outcomes, which are typically assigned a higher probability. But you do need to be very, very careful about this. And here's why. As it says at the start here, most epidemics are localized. Now, the locale can be very large, but it's still geographically limited. So, for example, the plague outbreak in London in 1665, the subject, of course, of Daniel Defoe's fictionalized journalism, A Journal of the Plague Year, was confined to basically London and Middlesex. It didn't spread much beyond that. Now, localized epidemics, which are the overwhelming majority of epidemic outbreaks, have a very distinct pattern. The pattern, if you plot the number of cases or deaths, is that of an inverted V. So you typically get very, very rapid growth in the initial phases of the outbreak because it's an epidemic, and therefore, by definition, you have exponential growth. But then, quite suddenly, it reaches a peak and then it declines. Now, if certain measures are taken, what you'll see is an inverted V where the downward leg is slower and more gradual, less steeply inclined than the upward leg of the V. But the pattern is always the same. You get a peak, you get a decline, and then that's the outbreak over. Now, that's a simple event. It's relatively easy to construct a model to explain how a geographically specific epidemic works. But a geographically dispersed epidemic, which is what we'll be talking about here, a pandemic is the extreme case of a geographically dispersed epidemic, is a complex system. Because what you have going on there is a disease that spreads from an original point of origin to a large number of separate locations which are geographically very widely dispersed and separated. Now, what that means is that although you can treat each one of those outbreaks initially as an individual geographically located epidemic, because of reinfection through travel, the epidemic as a whole, the pandemic as a whole, is a complex system. And it's extremely difficult, maybe even in some cases theoretically impossible, to construct a model that will accurately explain how a complex process such as a geographically dispersed epidemic or true pandemic is going to work. The problem, in other words, is that you cannot predict how something will be in the future simply on the basis of initial conditions or certain kinds of information that you have about the start, because the process through which the epidemic will spread will typically involve all kinds of complicated feedback loops and other mechanisms that are actually almost impossible to capture in a mathematical model. So a geographically dispersed epidemic is much more difficult to deal with than one that is confined to a particular locale. And, important point which I'll return to, a geographically dispersed epidemic typically has a pattern not of an inverted V, but of a pattern of phases. So what you actually typically have is more than one peak. There isn't typically just one inverted V-shaped outbreak. Now, here are some recent pandemics. These are true pandemics. In 1889 to 90, we had so-called Russian flu. Broke out in the far east of Russia, spread around the world very rapidly, killed, according to our best estimates, at least 1 million people. In 1894 to 1922, we had the third great pandemic of the bubonic plague. The world really did dodge a bullet here because this pandemic was pretty much confined to East Asia, to China, India, and Southeast Asia. As it says here, it killed 10 million people in India alone, a significantly larger number of people in China. We're not quite sure how many. It did make it to California, but that was the only really big outbreak of plague in that pandemic outside East Asia. Had it got out of East Asia, as it very easily could have done, who knows what would have happened, but as it was, the world had a bit of a let-off there. Then we have the pandemic that's been in the news quite a lot lately as people have looked for examples of things like what we're experiencing now, the so-called Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 1919. It actually didn't start in Spain, by the way. It began, we are absolutely certain now, on a pig farm in Kansas. And then got from there into a US Army camp, and all those US soldiers then brought it across the Atlantic to Western Europe. This killed at least 50 million people worldwide. The top end of the estimates for the number of people it killed are close to 100 million. So that was a truly devastating pandemic. It killed several times more people than had been killed during the Great War that it came at the end of. The fatality rates, the infection fatality rate of Spanish flu varies considerably from about 0.5% in some parts of the world to 13% in others. That's a function of things like the level of medical care that was available, the wealth of the part of the world where it struck, and the extent to which people were packed together in conditions that facilitated the transmission. It's also worth saying the Spanish flu came in two waves, and the second wave was significantly more deadly and virulent than the first by a factor of probably 3 or 4, which is something that often happens with major pandemics. In 1957-58, we had Asian flu, so-called, breaking out in southern China, we probably think. That killed globally about 2 to 5 million people. The reason why there's such a wide range is because a lot of the deaths in places like Africa, Latin America, were not accurately recorded, so we can only really make a guess at that. We know for certain that it killed 2 million people. It could easily have been more, though. Then we have one that I can actually personally remember, the Hong Kong flu pandemic of 1968 to 69. This killed between 1 and 4 million people worldwide, and those figures are actually quite confident. We're pretty sure that it did actually end up killing close to 4 million people. 1 million is an absolute certainty and a very conservative estimate. That pandemic killed about 70 to 80,000 people in the United Kingdom. So it was a very serious outbreak. We're probably going to, with the current pandemic, exceed the global death tolls for both Hong Kong flu and Asian flu. We don't know yet whether we will exceed the death toll we had in Britain with Hong Kong flu. But those are both very, very serious outbreaks. The most recent flu pandemic was in 2009 to 10. This was so-called swine flu. Now, that turned out to be a highly infectious illness, but also relatively mild. It only killed 500,000 people worldwide, which in terms of the size of global population is not a lot, really. And it's worth saying at this point that one of the features of pandemics or epidemics in general is that there's an inverse correlation between the severity of the illness, the number of people it kills, and the rapidity of its spread. The more infectious a disease is, typically, the less dangerous it is. Conversely, diseases that kill a lot of the people who get it or make them really, really ill are typically not very infectious. So SARS, for example, which COVID-19 is related to, of which we had an outbreak in East Asia about 15 years ago, SARS killed about 10% of the people who got it. But because of that, it wasn't very infectious. The reason is quite straightforward. If the disease is killing a lot of people or making them so ill that they can't even move around, then they've not got much chance to infect other people. And so therefore there's an inverse correlation historically between the actual severity of an illness and the chances of its killing people normally. There are two big exceptions to that though. One, which we'll look at in a moment, is illnesses where there's what's called a reservoir effect, where the pathogen, the disease-causing entity, exists in a reservoir of some kind, which means that even if people are dropping dead like flies, it can constantly reinfect the human population. The other is the very rare case of illnesses which are extremely deadly, but also so incredibly infectious that even if it kills you within a matter of days, you've still got a good chance of infecting other people. The classic example of that was smallpox, which historically had a death rate and a fatality rate of about 20 to 25% in the old world, much, much higher in the new world when it arrived there, and which typically was so incredibly infectious that even though it was killing people in a matter of 4 to 5 days, it still spread very widely. So we should really say a few words of thanks to all those people at the WHO who managed to eradicate smallpox a few years ago. Now, here are the 3 big historical pandemics. These are the really, really big outbreaks. First of all, you have the Antonine Plague between 165 and 180 AD. This was almost certainly an outbreak of smallpox, maybe measles, but most people think it was smallpox. It killed 25% of the affected population. It struck both the Roman and Persian empires. It originated somewhere in the Middle East and then swept across the Roman Empire and also the Sasanian Empire. But it also, a couple of years later, got into Han China and completely devastated North China. And it was one of the major factors in the collapse of the Han Empire a couple of decades later. Then there was the Great Plague of Justinian, which broke out first in 541 to 542 AD, killed about 40% of the population of Constantinople. The Byzantine historian Procopius gives an extremely powerful, vivid description of the terrible suffering of the population of Constantinople and other Byzantine cities during the plague. There were then recurrent outbreaks of this plague over the next couple of centuries. It doesn't really fade away until 750. And then finally, there's the really big one, the one that I'm sure you all have heard of, the Black Death, which first breaks out in China in 1331, in Hubei province, interestingly, where COVID-19 first broke out, and which lasted until 1353. As we'll see in a moment, it swept right across Eurasia. And following that, there were recurrent outbreaks of the bubonic plague in Eurasia until the 18th century. The Black Death reaches Western Europe in 1347, port of Messina in Sicily, where it was brought by a ship that had come from Kaffa in the Crimea, and from there it spread in a succession of waves right across northwest Europe until it reached Norway and the extreme northwest of Scotland about 5 to 6 years later. It also had arrived in the Middle East about 1347, and it reached Morocco about the same time that it reached Norway. And both of those final two killed 40 to 45% of the affected populations, and they significantly reduced total global population. The best estimate we have is that the Black Death, which remember didn't affect the New World, killed about 35% of the world's population in a matter of 25 to 30 years. And it took global population well over 150 years to recover from this truly devastating epidemic. So however badly you may think we're having things at the moment, they are nothing like the kind of experience that our ancestors went through in the 14th century, or indeed the 6th or the 2nd. Now, very quickly, something about the historical patterns, and this is where the economics comes in. The spread of an epidemic is limited, as it says here, by 2 kinds of factors. One is the thing I've already touched on, the medical features of the disease and the pathogen. How is the disease transmitted? How virulent is the pathogen? How contagious is the pathogen? But also, it's affected by the social and economic structure of the world. And in particular, it's affected by the degree to which the world is interconnected through trade and travel of all kinds. If you imagine a world where the economic structure is such that most people live in isolated and economically self-sufficient communities, then you're not going to get very wide geographical dispersion of an epidemic illness. You may get a local outbreak, but it's very unlikely to spread widely geographically. On the other hand, if you have a part of the world, or even the whole world, which is highly interconnected with lots of long distance travel, then epidemic illnesses can spread very, very rapidly. And as it says here, a pandemic is an epidemic that spreads to all parts of an ecumene. Now, what is an ecumene? That's a word that comes from Greek, originally means a household. An ecumene is a part of the world which has a complete division of labor, which is completely integrated through a network of trade and exchange, and which therefore has lots and lots of economic specialization, lots and lots of long supply chains, a very advanced division of labor. In the historical context, this meant large parts of the world, like, say, the Mediterranean lands, the Middle East, North and South China, the whole of the Indian subcontinent, perhaps. Today, because of modern developments in technology, it means the entire planet. Now, major pandemics, therefore, typically happen after you've had a prolonged period of increased economic integration over a large part of the planet. So the Antonine Plague, for example, broke out after you'd had almost 200 or 300 years of increasing economic connection and specialization within the lands around the Mediterranean, and also within the lands of the Middle East, the Persian Empire. They typically spread along major trade and travel routes. So what you find is that if you track the transmission of a major pandemic, you'll find that the pathogen travels along major trade routes. Now, very importantly, what that means is it tends to hop over intervening territory. It doesn't spread necessarily in a straightforward, continuous way across the planet's surface. It tends to follow the trade routes, and therefore it will go on things like ships, or in the modern world, aircraft, and miss out intervening bits of territory. It's not just trade, by the way. Soldiers and the military are also a major factor in the spread of illnesses in the past, as are pilgrims and religious travelers. So one of the great cholera pandemics in the 19th century, for example, mainly spread because it broke out during the Hajj in Mecca and was taken by Muslim pilgrims from Mecca all over North Africa, South Asia, and even into Southeastern Europe. Which led, imagine, to a terrific explosion of the disease at that time. So it's major trade routes, but you shouldn't just think about trade. You should also think about pilgrimage, tourism, business travel, military movements, anything that moves lots of people around the planet's surface. When you get the initial outbreak of a pandemic, you find that, therefore, the really big initial outbreaks are in highly connected cities. Cities that either are the centers of empires or major pilgrimage centers, or more commonly, are major trade hubs. And this is because they have people visiting them from a long distance away, and therefore they very often bring the illness with them. And so they then become the foci of the pandemic. You can see this very clearly during the current pandemic, where if you look at Europe, for example, the major outbreaks initially took place in places like Milan, Paris, Barcelona, Madrid, London, highly connected, globally linked cities. In North America, the biggest outbreak by far, by some margin, has been in New York, again, a highly connected global city. Almost certainly, by the way, it reached New York not from China, but from Europe. All of the evidence that's been picked up suggests that. Now, the countryside is not actually safer in the long run. What very often happens when you have a pandemic is that the people who can, the wealthy, tend to pack up their bags and bugger off from the city and go and live in the countryside. Maybe they then sit around a table in a monastery and tell each other stories for 10 nights, like the people in Boccaccio's Decameron. But that actually is not good, because what it does is to actually disperse the pathogen, the disease-causing organism, more widely. So in the longer run, this flight from the city actually is self-defeating, because what it does is to spread the pathogen more generally throughout the less traveled, less densely populated rural areas, and so make the ultimate effect of the epidemic even worse. One of the things which is very important at the moment is that large-scale epidemics originate in areas where the human world butts up against the natural world. This can be either intensive agriculture, or it could be where the human world is butting up against wildlife habitats of one kind or another. The reason for that is quite simple. Major epidemics that get out of control and prove very hard to contain are almost always caused by a novel pathogen, a new kind of virus or bacterium. And the way that they arise is by jumping from another species of animal often pigs, sometimes chickens, sometimes wild animals, into humans. And so to the extent that the human world is pushing up very hard against the natural world in some way, then you're more likely to get novel pathogens forming, and those pathogens then being transmitted into the human world. It's worth saying that at the moment, a number of features of the way we live, in particular, the way that modern livestock farming works, are making the development of novel pathogens much, much more likely. Modern livestock farming, intensive feedlot farming, is an almost perfect breeding ground for novel pathogens, and it's very easy because of the close human contact for them to then make the jump to human beings. Similarly, the pressure on wildlife habitats in places like Africa and South America is also providing ample opportunities for pathogens to make the jump from various animal species to humans. This, of course, is what has happened with COVID-19, which is originally found in bats, then made a jump to pangolins, and then came from pangolins to humans through the so-called Chinese wet markets. And this is a key point which I'll expand on in a moment. Major pandemics typically come in waves. They do not have that form of a single outbreak with an inverted V. Historically, they normally come in waves, and it's normally the second wave that is the really big one that does the most damage. Now, that's not inevitable. This is not destiny, because we now have the resources and the science to perhaps cut that off, but it's quite a challenge, as I'll explain in a moment. So this is how a dispersed epidemic works. And this is what we're dealing with at the moment. First of all, it starts in a very specific place. So, as we'll see in a moment, that both the plague of Justinian and the Black Death start in a very specific point on the planet's surface. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic began in a very specific place in China, in Hubei province around Wuhan. What then happens is, as I've explained, it spreads via trade and travel routes to connected hubs. And in the process of doing this, as I said, it leaps over the intervening territory. And so what you then get is a pattern of outbreaks over a very large geographical area, maybe the entire planet, but with those outbreaks being initially not very much connected. They're taking place almost like discrete but simultaneous outbreaks in the various infected hubs. This is the so-called first wave of the pandemic. We're currently just moving out of the first wave because all of those dispersed outbreaks that are produced by that transmission along trade routes have now pretty much peaked, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. This is not true in places like Latin America, particularly Brazil or elsewhere. What then happens is that it subsides. But what happens is you enter then what's called the smouldering phase, the second phase of the pandemic, which is where you have a low level of infection gradually spreading out more and more widely geographically. You get, if you think of a fire burns very, very hot, but the embers, the red hot cinders that are left behind, remain hot for a very long time. And this is the smouldering phase of the pandemic. You still have very small, very localized outbreaks, and you still get transmission as people who have the illness move around. This is a particularly serious problem with COVID-19 because of the now established fact that 80% of the people who have it do not have symptoms, which means that they will not realize for a long time or ever that they have it and that are therefore infectious. That means that therefore it's quite easy for an illness like that to spread very, very widely during the smouldering phase. Then what happens is that the small localized outbreaks tend to join up together and merge. And plus, you also get reinfection from distant locations in a kind of complex feedback loop model. And what this leads to is a much, much larger and geographically more even outbreak, the so-called second wave. As I say, because it's more geographically dispersed, this is typically larger, affects more people, and is much more difficult to manage than the first wave. One of the features of the second wave, by the way, is that areas that are very badly hit in the first wave tend to get off lightly. That's because the badly hit areas in the first wave have typically got a lot of their population with acquired immunity from having been exposed to the illness and survived it. And so they typically are areas which are highly resistant to the second wave. It's, on the other hand, areas that didn't do so badly during the first wave that tend to be really hit severely during the second wave. So here we have a few historical examples. This is Justinian's plague. And you'll see how it comes up the Red Sea to a place called Pelusium in 540 AD. From there, it travels by ship directly to Constantinople, but also overland to Antioch. And it also goes from Alexandria right across the Mediterranean to places like Marseille, Rome, and Ravenna. And so you get a massive outbreak originating in Pelusium and Alexandria, but then spreading to Constantinople, Thessalonica, Ravenna, Rome, Carthage, all around the Mediterranean in 541 to 543. What you then find is that these areas, places like the middle of Anatolia or the hinterlands of the Balkans, hardly suffer at all because the epidemic has leapt over them. If you look at the dotted lines on this map, they show the track of the second wave, which begins about a decade later. And that actually starts in places like Constantinople, and it spreads from there right around the Mediterranean for a second time. And also this time it gets into the Sasanian Empire, the Persian Empire, and then proceeds to go through there to China, reaching Chang'an. You can probably see it there, the capital of China. Then you get another map here showing the actual path. We're pretty certain now that the plague begins in the savanna of East Africa. It develops amongst the rodent population in the savanna plains of East Africa, which at this time are under quite severe pressure from the growth of human population in the Swahili coast. It then spreads from there to the Swahili coast, to the trade cities, and from there it's taken by the trade route up the Red Sea to Alexandria and Pelusium. You'll notice that the spread misses out the whole of the lower Nile Valley and the Horn of Africa, which is an example of the kind of scattered and dispersed spread along trade routes that I described a moment ago. Here's the Black Death. There are two different theories about where the Black Death actually originated. One has it originate in the Mongol ancestral homeland, oops, sorry about that, the Mongol ancestral homeland in Central Asia. The other has it originating in northern Burma. What we do know for certain is that it breaks out in China here in 1331. And it then spreads, if you look at the red arrows there, all the way across Eurasia, following the Silk Road, but also, which they haven't shown on this map, following those other routes down into Persia and into the Delhi Sultanate, India, and also then Sumatra, Java, Southeast Asia on ships, is carried, of course, by rats, which means that it's very easily transmitted by merchant caravans and by long-distance maritime trade. So you can see how if you were to draw a map of the major trade routes of that period, the map and the fit with the transmission of the Black Death is almost perfect. The only additional thing is the movement of Mongol armies, this being the time when the Mongols rule most of Eurasia. This is Spanish flu in 1918 to 1919. The red arrows show the spread of the first wave. You'll notice that the numbers are the time it takes for the disease to spread. You'll notice it takes 5 months, if you look at that there at the Atlantic, for it to spread from the eastern coast of the United States, military camps, to Western Europe. Then you get the second phase, where you'll notice that the second phase starts in France, and it then takes just 1 month to go back across the Atlantic to North America from Europe. Now, these days, the spread of COVID does not take months, because in those days you're talking about fast steamships. Today, of course, you're talking about aircraft, that the spread can literally take days, certainly no more than weeks. So it's far, far more rapid. But again, you'll see the same kind of pattern. This is a recent case where I think we dodged a bullet, which was the outbreak of Ebola a few years ago in West Africa. The dark orange countries are the countries that see major outbreaks. Now, the reason why we didn't have a major pandemic was because the Nigerian government did a fantastic job of preventing the spread from getting into Lagos. Had it done that, it would almost certainly have gone all around the planet. That dotted line, by the way, is the range of a whole number of species of fruit bats which provided a biological reservoir for the Ebola virus. That's why, had it gotten out of Lagos, that part of the world would almost certainly have suffered a really, really severe epidemic. And Ebola has an extremely high fatality rate. So that would have been a major, major disaster, but we've managed to dodge it. Now, very quickly, the economic impact of pandemics. The typical impact is to lead to a pullback from economic integration and globalisation. It typically leads to the end of periods of accelerating economic integration. From the economist's point of view, this is unmitigatedly bad news, but unfortunately, it's almost certain to happen. It also leads to an acceleration of pre-existing trends. In this case, things like employment. So I think that the pattern of working from home, which was beginning to grow very, very slowly, is likely to accelerate dramatically. It's also very likely that this will probably accelerate the trend that was already well underway of killing off a lot of brick and mortar retail and shifting a lot of retail online. Very quickly, it's likely to lead to a revival of state ownership of industry, but a decline of regulation. There's almost certainly going to be major reforms to the welfare state. We may move to a UBI, which is being much talked about at the moment, but there's going to be significant opposition to that. So we may instead reform the welfare system in a different way, such as universal basic services. Historically, it's often led to a growth in state power and functions. So cholera in the 19th century led to the growth of the sanitary state. The idea that the state had a responsibility for things like drains and drinking water. But sometimes it's undermined it, because sometimes what big pandemics do is lead people to realize how ineffective the state is. And it will accelerate a shake-up in politics. I won't go into more than that. Now, however, it does have big cultural effects, and I'll wrap up now by throwing a few things on the table for the discussion that we're about to have after this. There are typically two contrasting reactions to major epidemics. One of them is people become serious. A lot of the self-indulgent stuff is chucked out the window. There's nothing like seeing death all around you to make you take a serious view of life. And so you tend to get a lot of people who think, enough of this rubbish, time to focus on the really big, serious questions. But at the same time, often the same people, you get a move towards living for the day hedonism, because if you think that you might die at any moment, you might as well take your pleasures where and when you can. Now, one of the things you do get is a major impact on literature, and I'll wrap up with a couple of quick things about this. This slide has got the title Illness as Metaphor, which is the title of a very famous book by the American critic Susan Sontag, written after she was diagnosed with cancer. And what she pointed out in this rather polemical and very angry book was that diseases and epidemics are often treated metaphorically, or they're used as metaphors for social reality. So as Sontag pointed out, both cancer in the modern world and tuberculosis in the 19th century was seen as illnesses that were caused by repressing emotions or feelings. TB in particular was thought to be a disease of the creative kind of person. And so actually people who wanted to be thought to be artistic would often pretend that they were suffering from TB, as she points out. Bizarre, really, given it's an utterly horrible illness and not at all romantic or attractive, but it was romanticized if you think of things like Verdi's La Traviata, where the heroine is, of course, consumptive, suffering from TB. But also, in that case, illness comes to stand for the negative effects of repression. And this is often extrapolated not just from the individual suffering from a particular illness, but for society as a whole. So you can think of the constant ways in which all kinds of social problems are described as being cancers on society. If you go into the 19th century, it was very popular to use the metaphor of illness to describe, again, social problems, social welfare problems in particular. And Sontag has lots of examples of how this is done. Another issue he points out is that epidemic diseases in particular are often described using the language of outsiders and invasion. Epidemics always come from somewhere else, and therefore they tend to be associated with the foreign, the alien, the outsider. This is one of the reasons why one of the common cultural responses to a major epidemic is a growth in xenophobia and hostility to the other, the outsider. And this is where you get the other thing I'll throw on the table, the language of plague and corruption. And so very often some particular illnesses are used as signifiers, symbols, for perceived decay or corruption in society in general. One of the classic examples of this is Camus' The Plague, La Peste, which is set in the town of Iran in Algeria, and where the passage of the plague is seen as being a symbolism or a signifier for the meaninglessness and randomness of the society which is inhabited by the major characters, particularly the central character, Dr. Rieux. In the 19th century, cholera and yellow fever in particular were used by authors to symbolize the barbarous and the unclean. Yellow fever was meant to symbolize the barbarous, the backward. The cholera, for obvious reasons, was used as a signifier for uncleanliness, corruption, decay. And it's worth thinking even today about how we use the language of plague in non-medical context. And it's a constantly used metaphor in all sorts of parts of life. Conversely, we often don't understand major epidemics in terms of medical terms. And one of the big divisions is whether it's understood as a public phenomenon or a domestic one. The way we think about the 1918-19 flu pandemic being a good example of that. And finally, this is going to happen again. This pandemic we're going through at the moment is not, repeat, not a black swan event. It was highly predictable. It was in fact a white swan event, which everybody who had studied this knew was going to happen sooner or later. And sooner or later, we're going to have one that's even more severe than the one we're experiencing now. And do not succumb to the bathtub fallacy, which is the fallacy of thinking that because the risk of breaking your leg in the bathtub is greater than the risk of your house burning down, you should therefore be more worried about the risk of breaking your leg in the bathtub than the risk of your house catching fire. That's a serious fallacy of mathematical reasoning. But at that point, I'll stop and I'll hand over to Kim.
Fascinating. Oh, sorry, I was muted there. Thank you very much, Steve. That was fascinating, and also thank you very much for bringing in that kind of literary discussion. I think there's a lot for us to talk about, and I can already see some questions coming up. So. Although there's plenty of things that I want to ask you, I'm not going to hog the opportunity to ask you questions. So I'm going to go straight over to Philip Booth, who's actually the Dean of our Faculty of EHSS. And Philip wants to say, Steve, your points about potential policy developments are bad news for classical liberals, apart from your suggestion that you would get a reduction in regulation. What makes you suggest that? Is it simply observations of past events, or is there a theoretical reason we can afford less bureaucracy? People have had to get used to acting without bureaucracy in order to act quickly in an emergency. Did you get all of that?
Yeah. Yes, okay. I think it's a mixture of both historical observation, but also more observation of the current experience that we're going through. In the past, what you very often find with major pandemics is that centralized governments prove to be not very good at dealing with it. They make a severe hash of it. And in some ways, you shouldn't blame them for this, because they're facing very, very acute knowledge problems. They really do not know what is going on. They're in the same kind of position that a general is in during a battle when he's faced with the fog of war and has no real idea about what's going on at the platoon or company level. But what this means is that people, as Philip suggests, become much more aware of what they can do themselves locally to deal with or cope with the fallout from the epidemic. And this tends to then make them think after the event, well, hold on a minute, why did we need all this stuff? Now, in terms of the current epidemic, I also observe that one of the things this has done is to lead to a lot of regulations being suspended for the duration. In particular, regulations of things like the development of drugs and medication. And the common response in many cases has been, well, hold on a minute, why did we have this regulation in the first place? This is crazy. I think most people did not realize just how difficult and torturous the process of developing and marketing a new medicine has become. Sorry, and so therefore I think it's very likely that a lot of that will not survive. there will be a feeling that after the event, we need to get rid of a lot of that. So I think it's a mix of the historical and the contemporary.
Thank you very much for that. The questions are coming in thick and fast now. So Saeed Kamal, who's Professor of Politics at Stanford University, wants to ask, based on historic precedents, can you say anything about the relative success of lockdown strategies? For example, Sweden, no lockdown versus other countries. Also, Camilla Stoltenberg, director of Norway's Public Health Agency, has said lockdown may not have been necessary. Two questions. Were there similar debates during previous pandemics? Is it too early to judge relative success of lockdown strategies?
Well, two questions. Yes, the answer is that total nationwide lockdowns of the kind that we see here have not been used before. What you have had in the past, however, is local lockdowns, or actually curfews, because this term lockdown is just a modern expression for a curfew, basically. And so with cholera epidemics, for example, in the 19th century, curfews were frequently imposed. Not that that did any good. It was based on a mistaken theory of how the disease was transmitted, the so-called miasma theory. But in the past, in 1918-19, for example, there were very extensive controls imposed on things like public gatherings in major cities, particularly in the United States, but also elsewhere. And what the evidence tends to show is that the earlier you did the lockdown, the better the recovery after the pandemic had passed. What you can also see, however, is that there are certain cases where they quite definitely either relaxed it too soon or where basically they were just caught out by the second wave. San Francisco was a classic example of that, where they relaxed the lockdown they'd imposed. It was pretty much a total shutdown of all business in San Francisco in the spring of 1918. And then they got hit by a second wave, and they were one of the worst affected cities in North America in the second wave. Now, the question about whether or not lockdowns were needed is a difficult one to answer, because it depends what you think the point of it is. And I think the purpose of these lockdowns initially was to prevent the spread in the first phase being so rapid that hospital systems became overwhelmed the way they were in Lombardy initially. And you could say that in that sense they've succeeded, albeit at a very, very high cost. I think the evidence is that the earlier you did it, the better it was, because obviously the less time the virus had to really get going and lead to a large number of cases. The problem, though, is that it's clearly done that job. And moreover, it may well be, now knowing what we know now, that you didn't need to impose it on countries as a whole. So in the British case, it might well have been the case that we should have had a lockdown in London, but not the rest of the country. The problem is, at the time the decisions were made, people didn't know enough to be able to come to that judgment. We still don't know a whole lot of key information. In particular, and it's outrageous that this is the case actually, we still do not know what percentage of the population have been infected. And that's the denominator for all the calculations we want to make. So the people really are flying blind. So I'm going to cut them quite a lot of slack and say, even though we might think now that a total nationwide lockdown was not necessary, I'm not going to second guess what they did at the time, given what they knew then. The problem now is that the purpose of the lockdown is now almost certainly not to prevent the collapse of the health system, but to try and get and keep the reproduction number below 1, to get it down to about 0.5, 0.6 at most. Now, I personally doubt that you're going to be able to do that, because in order to do that, you'll have to keep it in place for a very long time. The problem is that as the lockdown is relaxed, it may well be that if you're not very, very careful, you'll enter the smouldering phase that I described, and then you will get a second outbreak, a second peak later on in the year. So how do you prevent that? And I think the answer is that that's where what is called test, track, isolate policy becomes absolutely critical. TTI, as inevitably has come to be called. And a TTI policy requires that you have a sufficiently low rate of infection, additional cases, that you can actually identify and track all of those new cases as they arise, and then track all the people they come into contact with. If you can do that, then you can probably head off a second wave. which would be something that has not happened before. All of those pandemics I went through have had a second wave. If we can get a TTI to work in that way, we might be able to face off a second wave. But I don't think lockdown is going to be a useful tactic for doing that. It's too much of a blunt instrument. It does too much damage. And also you just have fatigue. People just get fed up and they stop observing it, which would make a second wave much more likely.
Exactly. Yeah, very interesting. We do have some other questions, but just before that, you touched on the idea of miasma, which is something which is particularly interesting to me as somebody who studies and writes about literature and one of the things I'm particularly interested in is this idea of smell and how diseases were spread. I think the novel that most obviously describes this is Thomas Mann's Death in Venice, when he talks about the putrid smell of the lagoon and the sirocco wind that's not conducive to health. It's very, I mean, cholera was what he was describing there from 1911. I don't know if you know very much about that, but I thought what was interesting as well is that the narrator talks about the threat to the economy of the tourist industry in Venice and the idea of a quarantine. And I thought what's particularly kind of really kind of chimes with what's happening today is there's this line that says there's an air of secrecy amongst the officials, with the highest medical officer resigning, filled with indignation, and he had been replaced with a more docile person. I don't know if you've got anything to say about this idea of miasma and how you know, things were passed through the air, because that's something that we're being told now is actually COVID-19 is something that can be transmitted through the atmosphere.
Airborne, yes. The miasma theory of in epidemics was very popular in the first half of the 19th century, up until the 1860s, really. And so the idea was that corrupting, rotting matter, things like cesspools, vegetable and other kinds of waste, corrupting bodies, put poison into the air, the miasma, which you then breathe in, and this then caused the illness, most notably cholera. And it's easy to see why people thought this, because of course cholera is caused in the first instance by drinking water that's contaminated with the feces of victims of the illness. And so obviously, therefore, it's associated with polluted water, which is obviously got a terrible smell usually. So the idea was that, yes, what you did was you locked people up in houses and you stopped them going out so they wouldn't be exposed to miasma. That lasted until John Snow's famous pump experiment, where he was in Soho outbreak in the 1850s, where he was able to show that everyone who contracted cholera in a particular part of London had drunk from a specific pump. It's one of the great masterpieces of empirical epidemiology, actually. He's a very important figure. And then a few years after that, Louis Pasteur was able to conclusively prove the truth of the germ theory of disease. So from Pasteur's epoch-making papers in the early 1860s, you then have a completely different understanding of what is actually causing the spread of illness. But there's still the very powerful association that you describe, which you find in Mann's book, between bad odor, bad smell, and the spread. Because although people talk about the fact they know by this time that there's a spirale in the water supply, or you can talk about things like the TB bacillus that's spread by the coughing consumptives, somehow the metaphor of smell or aroma, because of its associations with corruption and decay and death, is a much more powerful literary trope for explaining this actual process of infection, it seems to me. And so it persists for a very long time, even after everyone knew, following Pasteur and Snow, this was not the way the illness is spread. And it's also, it's worth saying, by the way, of course, I mentioned Camus' The Plague. Dr. Rieur discovers the first case, the patient zero, if you like, in that book. And he's then frantically trying to get the authorities in Iran to impose a curfew to stop, he thinks, the spread of the plague. But they delay this and they don't do it, again, for economic reasons, until the plague has gotten out of control. And he knows at this point that you know, it's too late. He can't do anything. He just has to treat the patients and work these incredibly long days and try to cope with it. So you know, one of Camus' main points in that book is about the uselessness of bureaucracy and indeed of a lot of human relations. It's a very dark book in many ways.
And also became a bestseller again as soon as COVID-19 broke.
Is that so? Okay. Well, a great work of literature. I'm always keen to see people reading Camus.
So Tom Packer wants to ask, how deep are the cultural impacts of epidemics? Isn't the emphasis on seriousness and hedonism, actually hedonism goes back to Thomas Mann, I think, in many ways, which is big in the literature, looked at another way, suggest it doesn't have much of an impact. Do you want me to read that again? I didn't read it very well.
Yeah, okay, yeah, read it out again, yeah.
Okay, so how deep are the cultural impacts of epidemics? Isn't the emphasis on seriousness and hedonism, which is big in the literature, looked at another way, suggest it doesn't have much of an impact?
No, I disagree with that. I think that if you look at the impact of the really, really big epidemics, like the Black Death being the quintessential example, you can see that the cultural impact is massive and long-lasting because on the one hand, you do get the sudden sort of breakdown. A lot of people lose their religious faith, for example. Very hard to believe in a benevolent God who's in charge of everything when you have such an unimaginable catastrophe strike you down. And so disbelief, hedonism, all that kind of thing suddenly has a huge upsurge, and you can actually trace this quite clearly in the intellectual and cultural life of places like Florence and Milan and other places, also France, Western Europe generally, actually. But on the other hand, you get precisely the opposite reaction, which is people who think, oh my God, God has sent this to punish us because we've been fearfully wicked. And so you get people like flagellants who parade through the streets whipping themselves. It becomes a kind of mass movement in Europe for quite some time after the actual onset of the Black Death. And you also get millenarian cults appearing who believe that this is a sign that we're in the end days. You can see why they thought that, and that therefore, you know, the last trump is soon to sound and the apocalypse will happen. And you also just get people who think, well, no, this is a sign that we should really forget all the frivolity and focus upon the really serious side of life. And so you do indeed get lots and lots of intellectuals saying, forget all this scholastic philosophy rubbish, you know, all this fine arguments about logic. It's time to start really thinking about, seriously about who is God, what does he want, why is he so angry with us, things of that sort. So I think these cultural impacts are very, very profound. And I think the Spanish flu pandemic is often overlooked in this regard. I think that actually had an enormous effect upon the culture and society of the 1920s, particularly in Germany, which was very, very badly hit by the second wave of Spanish flu, partly because most of the people in Germany were still severely malnourished because of the Allied blockade, which was kept up in force until the Treaty of Versailles was signed right at the end of the year. And so what it leads to is the kind of frantic gaiety and hedonism of Weimar Berlin, and the feeling that you were living in a world that was really meaningless, so you might as well create the meaning you wanted to have, the kind of world that Christopher Isherwood describes, for example, in his Berlin diary. So I think that epidemic had an enormous effect upon the culture and mindset of both the United States and Western Europe. And the fact that it came just after a truly terrible war, I think only added to its impact.
I think that's really interesting. I think you touched upon something about the kind of the health of society in a way, and that goes back to Oedipus the king and the kind of, you know, the body politic. There's something, the city itself is unhealthy, and there's some kind of curse that's kind of falling, that's coming upon the people, and the only way to kind of get rid of this curse of disease is for someone to be sacrificed, or someone to get to the bottom of whoever's done wrong. So again, that goes back to Susan Sontag and the idea of sort of metaphors of illness.
Precisely, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so Saeed has sent a litany in time of plague, which I think most people, I'm going to read it out as our last, as our closing comments then for this really fantastic webinar. And just before I read it out, I just want to say thank you very, very much, Dr. Steve Davies. You've been an incredible presenter, and I full of knowledge, and I can only kind of say, you know, how grateful we are to you for doing this for St Mary's. So thank you. So I shall read out Said's message. So this is Thomas Nash, A Litany in Time of Plague. Rich men trust not in wealth. Gold cannot buy you health. Physic himself must fade. All things to end are made. The plague full swift goes by. I am sick, I must die. Lord, have mercy on us. Beauty is but a flower, which wrinkles will devour. Brightness falls from the air. Queens have died young and fair. Dust hath closed Helen's eye. I am sick, I must die. Lord, have mercy on us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.